Welcome to the University of California, San Francisco Sports Medicine Podcast featuring Dr. Pandya, Dr. Brian Feeley, and Dr. Drew Lansdown discussing hot topics in sports medicine and society.
Welcome to the UCSF Sports Medicine Podcast, 6 to 8 weeks with myself, Dr. Pandya, Dr. Brian Feeley, and Dr. Drew Lansdown. Today, we have the honor of having Carlos Yustis, the sports anchor at Telemundo 48, who we all know very well through social media and through TV as well, too. He just came back from Tokyo, so we'll definitely be asking him some questions about his experience at the Olympics. So thank you for joining us, Carlos. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Nira. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Drew. I actually think I'm very close to Brian in different ways. Really excited to be here. I'm excited that you guys invited me. I always obviously follow everything you guys say. You're also big on social media. I mean, come on.
Great. Well, thank you for following us. You make us feel special. So, our first question for you, Carlos, just a little bit more. Tell us how you got into broadcasting and sports in general. Tell us a little bit about your background, if you don't mind.
To make the story not too long, I played soccer semi-professional in Mexico. I played up to second division with a team called Cruz Azul. I was on their farm system. My dad didn't retire me because he said that there was a lot of politics involved with soccer. There's still a lot of politics involved in how you develop as a soccer player, but nowadays a little better than it used to be 20 years ago when I was doing that. So he completely took me out of it. But I did play, at a very competitive level. I was 14, 15 years old. I was one of the really big kids in Mexico. So that helped out. My physiology always helped out. And then I was very good with tactics. So that was one of the things that kind of like promoted me to move on the teams compared to other kids, even though I was not the most technically gifted one. I'm pretty decent, but it wasn't like, if you compare me to the rest of my teammates were fantastic and I was just okay. But tactically, I was very sound, and that's one of the reasons why I was able to move on. Once I stopped playing, I moved to the States. I moved to Miami with my family. I played high school. I didn't play college because I got a full ride scholarship for grades. I ended up using that scholarship to go to school for film. But my parents are actors, so it was kind of like in the family. They were not really happy that I was doing it, but they were like, you know what, if that's what you want, like, it's okay, we're going to support it. And while I was going to school for film, I was also coaching soccer already. My high school decided to keep me as a coach since I wasn't playing college. So I coached high school soccer for 12 years. I actually was able to win 2 state championships in Florida, which is actually pretty competitive. So that was good in my career-wise. But with that background, I met one day playing soccer. They invited us to play a pickup game. I met this guy who was a producer for sports in Univision, which is the competition of Telemundo. And he was the first person that was like, have you ever thought about doing sports on television? And I was like, I was like 20 years old at the time. I was still in college. And I was like, well, that does sound interesting because, I watch a lot of sports on television. It's like, come over and I'll show you more or less, kind of how the business is and we'll go from there. I was really nosy. So I started throwing stats like, are you sure about that stat? Wasn't that in 2005 when this is such and such happened? And he was like, man, how do you know that on top of your head? I'm like, I just watch a lot of sports. So he eventually offered me a job. I worked in Univision for a year and a half. And after that, they didn't renew my contract. I went back to coaching. And then my dad had been working at Telemundo for a certain time. So they were looking they told me that they were looking for somebody who to be a sports producer for a new show that they were developing on Telemundo that was actually bilingual. So I applied for that job. I got it. And I started there. It was 6 years that I did sports producing. I was a line producer. I was a field producer. I actually traveled to a lot of the games that Telemundo will produce. But when I was leaving the Univision, my boss was like, hey, listen, I'm going to tell you something, take it or leave it. That's, it's up to you. But I think you have the personality to be on air. That's something that you should explore if you like. I mean, I'm not saying that you have to do it, but it's there if you want. So I kind of prepared myself for that. And those 6 years, I kept taking like acting lessons and voice lessons and try to prepare for more of an on-camera persona besides the work I was doing behind. And when Telemundo got the rights to the World Cup in 2015, I actually, begged my bosses to do that casting. It's like, please let me try to do this. And they let me call games. And I ended up calling games for the U15, the U20 World Cup, the U17 World Cup, the Women's World Cup, and beach soccer song. But I still wanted to be full-time on air, and that was something I was not able to do there, and I quit. I was like, you know what, guys, I love you, I love working with you, but I'm gonna go try to do this somewhere else. I became a YouTuber for almost a whole year. It was actually going very well, but I applied for a job in McAllen, Texas, which is in the border with Mexico down in the Rio Grande Valley. And I landed that job, and that was my first on-air job. It was the same thing I'm doing now with sports, the local sports anchor for Telemundo there. And then after 2 years, I got called to do the Women's World Cup and the World Cup in Russia. Those were my two big events already on air as a reporter. And then they called me over here and they told me there was a possibility to move to the Bay Area. And I love the area. So I was like, before they finished offering me the possibility, I was like, okay, I mean, that's it. Like, I'm moving. So we moved over here, and it's been 2 years already. Pandemic hit a little bit. I hadn't been able to enjoy the area as much as I liked. And right now Tokyo also came up, and I was able to go and come back.
Yeah, that's great. So it must have been pretty fun to go to Tokyo, even though on screen it looked a lot different. What was your biggest surprise from covering the Olympics, either from the athletes or the atmosphere there?
I think surprise-wise, I wouldn't say surprise, but it was strange. I mean, these were my third Olympics. I did London, I did Rio, and this was my third Olympics. I actually was on site for Rio. And there was just something about, it was strange to be in a place where it had such a big event and not see people from everywhere. And like, there's no like traffic of people moving and that kind of sort of thing, like the parties that's always involved with that. There's a lot of events that the Olympics actually do around the Olympics that you're able to attend, and they're really fun. And those things were all gone. It seemed very like, methodic to like go to the hotel, go to the venue, go to the Olympic Village, talk to the athletes will go out. And then the athletes were also in that same, the kind of same realm where they were able to talk to each other at the diner or the restaurant where they were actually able to serve food. They actually were able to interact kind of there a little bit, at least take pictures and run into each other while they were moving here and there. But that international area that usually the international plaza is called, that usually will have a lot of movement of people, wasn't there. So to me, that was the only thing that was, it was strange. It just gave you that feeling that you were covering the Olympics, but it didn't feel like it was really the Olympics because there's no people, the events were isolated. So to me, that was the biggest thing that was like very different from others.
And so, Carlos, when you were there, what was the biggest story amongst the athletes and competitors? Like, for us watching here in the US, obviously, I think the biggest one that stood out was the challenges that Simone Biles was facing. Mm-hmm. But what did you see as like the biggest thing going on when you were there?
I mean, all the athletes mentioned it in a certain capacity. What happened to Simone? I was able to talk to at least 20 to 25 of the athletes who competed from the Hispanic countries. And a lot of them talk about, my psychologist to get here, going through the pandemic with my psychologist. I had a lot of the mental work to come here. It was not so much, and a lot of the sound bites I was getting, it was a lot about, the preparation with stuff, or some of them actually benefit from it because they were in a bad spot because they were injured, and the recovery was not going to be good enough for 2020, and all of a sudden they gave them a whole year to recover better. So I think that was kind of like the biggest, topic among the athletes in general, that it was a thing about mental health to get there. And a lot of people, they wouldn't see that work because even though Simone was so vocal about it and talked about it, a lot of them did that work and they just kind of like, overlooked it and say that was part of my preparation to be here. That's it.
That's really interesting. And, with your experience at prior Olympics, prior, large, international events, have you ever heard athletes talk that openly about their preparation with a psychologist?
Yes and no. I mean, I feel like athletes in general is something that I wouldn't have an exact time frame, but maybe in the past 5 to 10 years, it's something that it's, broader. I remember when I was playing, I was the first generation that was trying to get into metrics and starting to do even yoga and other things that were not necessarily focused on soccer. Also about the preparation of how you prepare physically for these games, because most of the time they would just put you on like one single track of physical development, and that's actually not ideal for every single body type and every single player. And we did have some sessions with psychologists, and a lot of players resented, right? It was like, why do I have to do this? Like this is not soccer. This is not something I have to do. So I feel like there's been, a constant flow of change in that sense of players doing it. And I feel like they've mentioned, like they would have mentioned before, but it was not something that was like very specific. This in general was like, you know what, I could be in a bad place and that would not let me compete, to compare to like, well, I have to compete regardless. And maybe I was there, maybe I put in the work, maybe the work wasn't good, but it was not a topic. I think that would be the main difference between even 5 years ago and now.
Kind of piggybacking on the Olympics, Carlos, a lot of times I'm sure that you develop relationships with athletes and teams, and that helps influence your reporting. Kind of compare that to what was in the Olympics, because I'm sure you didn't have as much contact with the athletes, but still trying to tell a story of what's going on.
Well, I think on this particular Olympics, I had more contact with the athletes, because one of the reasons why it was harder to cover them is because usually you're able to grab stories around it, or maybe you go cover the event and get to talk to the people. Like sometimes you focus on the fans, and it depends on what you're assigned to. In this specific case, I was assigned to the athletes very specifically, and because they had nothing else to do either, those windows to talk to them became a little bigger. So by the time they will get there, we'll set up. They had to set up in a very specific way, that they had to be like 10, 12 feet away from me, probably a little more. And you had to set up the camera, and you had to set up the microphone. You get to talk to them. You get to talk to other people there in the delegation. And I think that it was actually, and now with social media too, I will talk to them, do the interview, then kind of like, a lot of them don't have a lot of followers, because it all depends on the sport. Not all the sports get the same viewership. So a lot of them didn't have a lot of followers. And I was like, let me try to help you out. Let's see if we can drag some traction to what you're doing. And I will do a lot of stories with them, and I started following them. So now, even now, I will post something, and I'll get one of the athletes send me a message and be like, "Oh my God, that was hilarious," or "Yes, I totally agree," or backwards. One of the guys from the Argentina volleyball team, which was the first person I interviewed when I got in Tokyo, his name is Federico Pereira. Fede, when he was going for the bronze medal, I hadn't seen him since the beginning of the Olympics, but I was like, "Hey man, good luck. I'm really excited for you, this and that." And "Oh, thank you, Carlos," whatever. So I think between social media and how these Olympics were portrayed, it was actually better for me to develop a relationship with them.
And how do you feel like when you're doing kind of more, non-Olympic type sportscasting here, do you feel like, your relationship with the teams or the athletes changes a little bit how you report? Do you ever get, the teams being like, "Oh, we don't want that story going out," or "Don't present it this way"? How do you kind of balance that?
I've been lucky enough, when you look at how the landscape in the Bay Area is, we're the only Spanish channel that covers them. They have a lot of coverage, obviously, because they're big teams, and a lot of them get national coverage, right? Like the Niners, for example, or even the Giants right now, they're getting a lot more eyeballs because they're doing really well. The San Jose Earthquakes in the Hispanic community are really big because they have a coach that have coached in one of the biggest teams in Mexico. So they get a lot of eyeballs from outside, but they also don't have a lot of eyeballs in the Hispanic community right here. So they collaborate a lot with us. We have really good relationships with basically every team here in the Bay Area. And the only time they will tell us something is when they actually give you something that you're in charge of. For example, I did the jersey launch with the San Jose Earthquakes. And now I can say that I had the jersey 5 days before it came out. So the only thing they asked me was please don't show it to anybody. It's yours, keep it. We want you to help you with the launch. So I prepared a video for the day of the launch so I could have it ready. But that's kind of a relationship I have with them. And I feel like actually the pandemic helped out in the sense that we're getting more stuff that we wouldn't get before, because just in constraints of travel, if I wanted to do something with the San Francisco Giants, and then I wanted to do something with the San Jose Earthquakes or with the Niners, they're so far apart from each other that I wouldn't physically be able to go from one to the other. But now I can do those 3 interviews back to back to back. And even for the teams and for the players, it's become a little more comfortable to be like what we're doing right now. Like you're in your office doing it. I didn't have to come over to you, and you had to set up a space, and we had to make it work. Now it's like, well, the time works. He's at home. He's not even practicing. Let's have an interview. So I think that has helped in a sense with the pandemic.
Yeah, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask you a little bit about your athletic career. So for those of us that follow you, we know that you've had a couple surgeries, and one of them was an ACL tear. And obviously this is pretty common for soccer players. What was it like for you recovering from your first ACL injury? And what was the biggest surprise for you in terms of the injury or the recovery, or what it was like to go through for our other athletes that go through ACL injury and rehabilitation?
Well, the worst part about it was that when that happened, I had stopped playing competitively at all. I had to completely stop playing. I was like, you know what? I had been playing professional, semi-professional at some point, and I stopped. I played with some college players. I played in a semi-professional team after that. That will be kind of like the NASL level, kind of like what the Oakland Roots were last year. I was playing at the level, and then I was playing in another league that was also with ex-professional players, but it was really rough. And I was like, I remember telling my dad specifically, like, I'm gonna stop playing this league because I'm gonna get injured and it's not worth it. I literally stopped playing 10 days before that. It's the day after my birthday. They asked us to play for a game. It was to gather money for kids with cancer. My team's getting blown out 9-1, and the goalkeeper comes out and decides to clean me from behind, and I ended up suffering the tear. And it was just the biggest part mentally frustrating was that at that point I read a study that it was basically like 4% of all ACL tears are due to trauma. Like most of the time is because you're a weekend warrior, you don't take care of yourself, you land wrong and you put too much weight and it happens, or maybe you're just unlucky in that sense of making that cut. I actually got into trauma, so to me it was first like to realize like this happened. I can't hold a judge against the guy who gave me the injury, especially because of the kind of game it was. So that was the first thing I had to put over the edge. I also had the problem that I went to get the MRI, and when it came out, they said I didn't have a full tear, and I didn't have surgery. I was like, oh, that's perfect. So I went to rehab for a couple of months. They told me I was fine, and then I went back to playing. And it was like 3 or 4 months later that by myself I made a cut and I felt that pop again. And I was like, you know what? There's something wrong here. Like I need to go look at it more in detail. But I'm gonna let it, because the other ones I was a little more rushed to see what happened. So I think I might have gone to the MRI a little sooner than I should have. Maybe with the swelling hadn't gone completely down, and nobody really like told me about it. And then the second time I went more, I was like, let me really swell this down. I'll go talk to Dr. Uribe, because I'm sure you guys are familiar with, and see what happens. I went, he said, yes, eventually that you actually have a tear. I did take, and I'll say this, I actually took a complete year between when it happened and when I went to actually have the surgery. And I kept running on it because a lot of people have this idea that you cannot do sports or run or do things on a torn ACL, and you can. You shouldn't put that out, but I did it. And luckily for me, my quads and my hamstrings were strong enough that I did not put more injury on it. That could have been like I didn't have a huge meniscus tear or something that could be associated with that. Once I had the surgery, obviously Dr. Uribe is a great physician, and it's a sports medicine. That was another thing that I was really concerned with, that a lot of people, when they get injured, they don't have the access, or maybe they don't think about that. If you do the recovery with a sports physician, they have in mind that you want to go back to play, because sometimes the fixes are just fixes and it's fine and you'll be able to have a normal life. But I wanted to go back and play. I was 25 years old and I wanted to keep on running. So I had the surgery. It tells me very serious, like, you won't be able to play professional sports. I'm like, Doc, do I look like I'm gonna play professional sports from now on? And I went to rehab, and the same, I pick a rehab place that rehab athletes, because that's another thing. It's like, it's not the same kind of rehab that you have when you have a lot of like older people that have maybe knee replacements going to this place, like somebody that actively uses their knees and shoulders and things to actually perform, and then at top level. So I went to this rehab place called Pancreas Therapy, and a lot of baseball and football players go there. While I was there, I ran into Mike Lowell consistently. Jimmy Graham was still playing. I think he was, at that point, he was with the Packers, and he came in like day in, day out. He would see me practicing. Like, I even had a sort of relationship with him, because he would come in and say, hey, you're putting the work. I see that. Good job. And I was like, thanks. And then I knew it was going to be a long recovery. I also knew that compared to, because you hear the time frames, right? Like, for example, like Dr. Nero talks about them all the time, but you got to realize that the time frame for an athlete, a professional athlete, it's not the time frame for you, because a professional athlete is going to do that day in, day out and go home and rest. I don't. I needed to do that and then go to work and have a different life. So I was able to at least get 3 months off work with short-term disability, mainly because of the crutches, because the moving up and down the building, I was able to push that a little bit and at least let me get out of the crutches. But once I was out of the crutches, it was this challenge of like making sure that my movement was not counterproductive to my rehab, and just try to go to rehab like as much as I could. And I ended up doing a year and I need like 14 months of therapy. So, I mean, again, like, I feel like my discipline, just because I was able to play sports at that level, helped out, but I could see how it was really frustrating for maybe some of like, high school kids that are not used to that level of having to commit every day 2-3 hours to put it together. But I was able to come back, and then, well, Dr. Feeley can talk to you a little bit more what happened after for the second surgery.
Yeah, we'll leave that one alone. That was, I think, the easiest surgery of the year. I think you make a lot of really good points. I think one of them is that partial tears, we often don't know. because especially in kids, you feel something, your knee swells up a little bit, maybe you go to the doctor and they say, well, it's a sprain, it doesn't feel that different. So we don't know how often people have partial tears, but that feeling of instability when you try to cut again is pretty common. And I think the other thing that's a really good point is that professional athletes go back, but it's still a 9-month recovery, and that's all they're doing. They're being paid to get better. They take care of their bodies. I won't say 24/7 because we do see that they do other things, but they're not going to work and working a desk job. They're not taking 3 weeks off from their rehab because they have to travel for family duties. That's their job to get better, and it's still a 9-month recovery. I've got one more question that is really important given your love of soccer. Who's your favorite Ted Lasso character?
Oh, of course, Danny Rojas. Like Danny Rojas is my boy. And I actually started, the name of the actor is Cristo Fernandez, and I started following him recently on social media. So I am making that call that I'm gonna get to talk to him at some point. So yeah, but there's a lot of common between Danny and I.
Uh-huh. I can see the resemblance and how much you like doing what you do. So
And Carlos, as we'll finish up, we'll ask you one really, really important question. Do you think Trey Lance or Jimmy Garoppolo will be starting week 1 for the 49ers?
Oh, that's tough. Come on.
No, I think I know. I think Jimmy is going to be starting week 1 because we're talking about week 1, like just week 1. They've said it since last year. There's never been a time because, like after covering the sport for a certain amount of time, when they give you, the typical spiel of like, that he's our guy or whatever, but nobody on the NFL has ever pushed so hard for a guy as John Lynch and Kyle Shanahan's have done. Like every single press conference, they will tell you straight up, and they knew they were going to draft Lance, and they will still be like, no, he's our guy, and he's our guy. And you can feel it on the team. Like even when you go now to the practices and you see the press conferences, there's a lot of camaraderie between Trey and Jimmy. And I think regardless of the development of Trey, and we saw it on the preseason game on this Saturday, there's still a lot of things that need to click with Trey to be a full professional, NFL starting quarterback. He has some great potential. He does some great things, like that 80-yard touchdown was fantastic. And his release on some plays is pretty ridiculous. But there's still things that he has to work on. And I feel like as long as Jimmy is actually healthy, even though he's not considered on the elite of quarterbacks, he's very good at game management. It's not something that Kyle Shanahan likes. And that was actually what was able to take the Niners to the Super Bowl. So I do see Jimmy starting, and then good knows what happens. I mean, hopefully Jimmy can stay healthy just for his own sake more than anything else. And we'll have to wait for Trey, but then Trey's definitely the future.
Yeah, Drew unfortunately is a Packers fan, so he's just sitting there and saying,
Not unfortunately.
Well, Drew's just thinking, God, I wish my quarterback was as nice as Garoppolo and everybody else on the 49ers. Well, Carlos, thank you so much for joining us. I think we learned a lot. We look forward to seeing you more on TV and social media. And, football is life.
Football is life. And thank you, everybody. I mean, thank you, everybody, for the questions. Thanks for the time. I know you're technically more busy than I am, even with my travels, but it's been a pleasure talking to you. And then obviously I follow you also on social media and gotta keep that good work, because there's you give a lot of insight to things that, my people some overlook or that take for granted, especially. So I think that's why every time you guys comment and do these kind of podcasts and everything, it's really important for everybody to learn. We're in a platform where everybody can learn nowadays, where you can actually look for the information if you want to. And I think that's really important.